7-month-old Emmanuel Haro severely abused.
It is tragic. It is the loss of a child, someone who will never grow up.
I just don't understand or fathom how parents can do this to their own kid.
Tonight, we confront one of the darkest and most painful revelations yet in the Emmanuel Haro case. Emmanuel was not just missing, he was only 7 months old, still at the age where his world should have been nothing but warmth, comfort, and love. And yet, behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the public, Emmanuel was suffering, severely abused. I want you to stop for just a moment and picture this. A baby too small to walk, too fragile to fight back, too innocent to even understand the danger around him. A child who should have been held close and protected, facing harm instead. That image alone should break every heart, but it should also make us ask, how did this happen? And more importantly, why did no one stop it? This is not just a story about one baby. This is a story about silence. About neighbors who whispered but never shouted. About a system that saw the warning signs but stamped the papers and sent him home anyway. About a community that now asks itself the most unbearable question of all: could we have saved him? And that is where the true weight of this case lies. Because Emmanuel's pain is not only a reflection of his parents' actions, it's a mirror held up to all of us. A mirror showing us how easily children can fall through the cracks when we choose comfort over confrontation, or when institutions choose procedure over protection. So stay with me, because over the next few moments, we are going to pull apart every detail. The injuries Emmanuel endured, the contradictions in his parents' stories, the failures of those who were supposed to safeguard his life, and the haunting truth of what happens when a society looks away from its most vulnerable. By the end, you'll see this case for what it truly is, not just a tragedy, but a test. A test of whether we are willing to speak for a baby who no longer can. A test of whether we are willing to demand justice, not just in Emmanuel's name, but for every child who suffers in silence. But before we dive into this, kindly subscribe to our channel if you believe in fighting for justice. Because every view, every comment, every subscriber is a stand against silence, and a step toward justice for those who cannot fight for themselves. We've just crossed 5,000 subscribers, all because of your support, and we need that same energy to reach 6,000, then 7,000, and then 10,000. So go ahead and drop your fingerprints on that subscribe button, and definitely where you're watching from, because wherever you are, the day this vision is fulfilled, I will send my appreciation straight to you. Let's keep building this community that stands and fights for justice together. Tonight, we face one of the most gut-wrenching realities of the Emmanuel Haro case. A 7-month-old child, fragile, innocent, defenseless, wasn't just failed. He was abused, severely, and the evidence now emerging paints a picture that no parent, no community, no system should ever allow. Think about this for a moment. At 7 months old, a baby is still learning to sit up, still reaching out for comfort, still crying only because he has no words. His entire survival depends on the arms that hold him, the voices that soothe him, the safety of his home. And yet, in Emmanuel's case, those same arms, those same walls, became the place of his deepest pain. Now ask yourself this, and don't turn away. How did an entire world watch as Emmanuel disappeared, while behind closed doors, he was already suffering? Where were the people who should have spoken up? Where were the protections he was promised? Why is it always the most innocent, the most defenseless, who pay the price for silence? The fragility of a 7-month-old cannot be overstated. His skin bruises at the slightest pressure. His cries are his only defense. And yet someone close inflicted harm. To abuse a baby this young is not just cruelty, it is the ultimate betrayal of trust. It is proof that evil does not always wear a mask. It sometimes hides in plain sight, inside the very place a child should feel most safe. And here is the line we cannot ignore. Emmanuel's suffering did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because of failures at every level. It happened because neighbors dismissed cries in the night. Because family members stayed quiet when something felt wrong. Because the system designed to protect folded under the weight of its own indifference. So stay with me, because this isn't just Emmanuel's story. This is a mirror held up to every community that looks the other way. This is about a system that collapses when children need it most, And it is about a baby whose voice was silenced, but whose pain should now speak louder than ever before. To understand how we reached this heartbreaking point, we need to go back. Back to the day Emmanuel Haro disappeared. A day when panic spread across his neighborhood, when search teams combed through fields and families clutched their children a little tighter. Emmanuel was just 7 months old, tiny, fragile, dependent, and yet he was suddenly gone. From the very beginning, the spotlight turned toward those closest to him, his parents. Scrutiny mounted quickly, as it always does. Their stories didn't line up. Contradictions slipped into interviews, and beneath the polished words, the first cracks began to show. But here's what makes Emmanuel's case even more haunting. Long before the day of his disappearance, there were signs. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about hearing his cries late into the night. Cries that sounded different, cries that lingered too long. Some claimed they saw bruises, small dark patches on arms too delicate to ever bear such marks. Others whispered about loud arguments inside the home, the kind that spill over walls no matter how tightly windows are closed. And yet, silence. No report strong enough to trigger immediate action. No knock on the door from authorities that came soon enough. People saw, people heard, but people looked away. And now we're left with the unshakable truth. If those cries had been answered sooner, maybe Emmanuel's story would be different today. Imagine that. Every single warning sign was a chance, an opportunity to intervene, to shield him, to step between innocence and danger. But those chances slipped by, one after another, like sand through desperate fingers. And with each missed moment, Emmanuel was left a little more vulnerable. This is where the guilt should weigh heavy. Because Emmanuel's suffering was not hidden in some distant, unreachable place. It happened in plain sight. It echoed in his cries. It showed in his bruises. And still, nothing was done in time. And so, when the day came that Emmanuel vanished, the world acted surprised. But the truth is, his disappearance was not the beginning of his tragedy. It was the culmination of failures that had been building, quietly, dangerously for months. When reports began to surface that Emmanuel had been severely abused, the world recoiled. Because what does that phrase really mean when applied to a child barely 7 months old? A child so small he could barely sit up without help. A child who still needed to be held, fed, protected every moment of the day. And yet, instead of protection, he was exposed to pain no child should ever know. Behind closed doors, pieces of Emmanuel's suffering began to emerge. Reports spoke of untreated injuries, tiny limbs carrying fractures that no infant could have caused on his own. Bruises that seemed to appear, fade and reappear again, telling a silent story of repeated harm. Some spoke of burns, the kind of marks that leave scars not just on skin, but on the very memory of what was done. Neglect was written into his daily life. Malnutrition, his small body showing signs that food was not being given as it should. Lack of medical care, sicknesses left untreated, discomfort left to fester. Every parent is meant to be a shield, but Emmanuel's shield was missing, replaced with silence, denial, and contradiction. Because when questions were asked, the answers were twisted. His parents, those who should have been his only defense, could not keep their stories straight. One moment they spoke of accidents, the next of misunderstanding. They shifted blame, dodged responsibility, and denied what their own child's fragile body was screaming to the world. And this is where the guilt tightens its grip. Because Emmanuel could not speak for himself. He had no words, no way to point at the pain, no way to explain the fear. His only language was his cry. A cry that should have been met with comfort, but instead was too often met with silence, or worse. Think about that. A baby whose entire world depended on the adults in his life, was instead left exposed to suffering, inflicted by those very hands. And the system, the neighbors, the community, we all missed it. We all turned away too quickly. The phrase severely abused is not just a clinical label, it's a mirror forcing us to confront what Emmanuel endured, and asking the hardest question of all, how could this happen, in plain sight, and still be allowed to continue? When we talk about Emmanuel's suffering, it is easy to point at his parents and stop there, but the truth is far heavier, far more damning. Because Emmanuel was not just failed by a home, he was failed by an entire system built to protect children like him. There were warnings, subtle, but there. Doctors who noticed bruises that did not match the explanations they were given. Neighbors who whispered about late-night arguments, about hearing Emmanuel cry for hours without comfort. Perhaps even social workers who filed reports, only to see those reports buried beneath paperwork, lost in the shuffle of an overloaded system. Child Protective Services, the very agency designed to be Emmanuel's safety net, became instead the net that slipped and tore. Did caseworkers visit? Yes. Did they ask questions? Yes. But after every visit, Emmanuel was sent right back to the very environment that was destroying him. And then there's the law enforcement response. Each call, each concern, was treated like just another item on a long list. A welfare check here, a quick report there, and then the boxes were ticked. No immediate danger, case closed. But those boxes were not paper. They were Emmanuel's life. Every stamp, every signature, every closed file, was another nail sealing him into a fate no child deserves. We must ask ourselves, how many opportunities were missed? How many times could someone, anyone, have intervened and pulled Emmanuel out of danger? And here's the guilt that gnaws at the heart of this case. It wasn't just his parents who failed him. It wasn't just a broken home. It was every adult who had a chance to step in, but looked away. Every official who said not enough evidence. Every worker who sighed, closed the folder, and walked to the next case. Emmanuel was not invisible. He was seen. He was heard. And still he was abandoned by a system that should have been his lifeline. And so the question remains, how many children like Emmanuel are out there tonight, crying behind closed doors, waiting for someone to act, while a system stamps its approval and sends them back into harm's way? When the doors of the courtroom opened, the world expected clarity, accountability, and perhaps justice for Emmanuel Haro. But what unfolded was something far more unsettling, because behind those walls, the evidence presented painted a portrait of unimaginable suffering. Medical records revealed the truth Emmanuel's tiny body carried. Records that showed untreated fractures, bones that had been broken and left to mend on their own. Doctors testified about bruises in patterns that no accident could explain. And the most chilling of all, injuries that specialists confirmed could only come from force, from deliberate harm, inflicted on a baby who couldn't even form words to call for help. And yet, despite this mountain of pain documented on paper, the courtroom echoed with a decision that shocked the public. One parent was released, walked out, set free, as if Emmanuel's cries, Emmanuel's wounds, Emmanuel's suffering were not enough to hold them accountable. How can this be? How can the justice system, faced with testimony after testimony, allow a parent linked to such cruelty to walk back into the world? The contradictions in their stories, the silence when asked the hard questions, the blame shifting, it was all there. And still the gavel came down, not in Emmanuel's favor, but in the favor of an adult who should have protected him. Inside the courtroom, gasps filled the air. Mothers wept. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. And outside those doors, the anger only grew. Protesters gathered, holding Emmanuel's name on their signs, demanding answers. Social media erupted with outrage. How do you release someone when a baby was clearly tortured? And here's where the guilt strikes deep. Because every parent who watched this ruling knew this could have been their child. Every citizen who walked past the courthouse steps knew justice isn't just blind. Sometimes it turns away. A 7-month-old endured more pain than most adults will ever know. And instead of iron bars protecting his memory, one of the very people tied to that pain was handed freedom. And so we ask, what message does that send? To every abuser watching, to every vulnerable child hidden behind closed doors tonight. The system spoke, but did it speak for Emmanuel, or against him? In the quiet streets where Emmanuel once lived, people are starting to remember things they wish they hadn't ignored. They remember the nights when his faint cries pierced the silence, cries too sharp, too desperate, to be mistaken for ordinary fussing. They remember glimpses through the window, a small figure with a bruise across his cheek, or a limpness in his body that no healthy baby should carry. Neighbors whisper now, confessing to each other what they kept tucked away back then. I thought something was wrong. I should have called again. I should have knocked on that door. And the weight of those regrets hangs heavy, because deep down, they know those tiny warning signs were Emmanuel's only voice, and their silence helped bury it. One neighbor admits they heard shouting, loud arguments between adults, and then moments later, a baby's cry that stretched on far too long. Another recalls seeing Emmanuel in a stroller with marks on his arm, brushed off as just a fall. They wanted to believe it. They wanted to look away, because speaking up meant confrontation, involvement, risk. And now, all that's left is guilt. Because silence in cases of abuse is never neutral, it is deadly. Every moment of hesitation, every decision to stay quiet, every excuse of maybe it's nothing stacked up until Emmanuel had no shield left. He was surrounded by eyes that saw, ears that heard, but mouths that stayed closed. Today, many in that community are haunted. Haunted by the thought that if they had knocked one more time, if they had made one more call, if they had refused to be bystanders, Emmanuel's story might not have ended in tragedy. And here is the truth no one wants to face. Emmanuel wasn't only failed by his parents. He was failed by an entire neighborhood that let whispers replace action. And now those whispers are all that remain. Whispers of what they saw. Whispers of what they didn't do. Whispers that echo louder than Emmanuel's cries ever could. The moment the truth about Emmanuel's abuse began to surface, the world lit up, not with candles of comfort, but with screens and headlines. Justice for Emmanuel's trended once again, as if repeating those words online could rewrite what had already been done to him. News outlets flashed his tiny face across every platform. Commentators dissected every photo, every court update, every rumor. And while some voices demanded arrests, accountability, and real justice, others, the defenders, rose up to shield the very people under suspicion. They argued, they excused, they twisted Emmanuel's suffering into debates about family loyalty. But here's the most bitter part. While strangers argued over hashtags, Emmanuel's cries were already silenced. The outrage came too late. The discussions that should have happened in real time, when he was alive, were replaced with digital outrage only after his suffering was exposed. And in the chaos of the online storm, his story was torn apart. Some turned it into conspiracy theories, searching for scandal rather than truth. Others used Emmanuel's name for clicks, likes, and shares, forgetting that behind this case was a baby who once reached for comfort and received pain instead. The guilt, then, doesn't just belong to the parents. It doesn't just belong to the neighbors or the official. It belongs to all of us who scroll past stories like Emmanuel's until the tragedy becomes too big to ignore. It belongs to a society that waits until hashtags trend before it demands justice. Because while the world was busy debating, Emmanuel was busy suffering, and every second of that delay cost him a chance at safety. So when we see justice for Emmanuel splashed across headlines, we must ask ourselves, why did it take his abuse becoming public before we cared? The truth is hard. Emmanuel became a story before he was given the chance to be saved. And that should break every single one of us. This is where the case of Emmanuel Haro cuts the deepest, because to understand what happened, we must confront the darkness of human behavior. Psychologists have long studied abusive parents. They lie, they manipulate, they create a mask of normalcy to hide the violence behind closed doors. To neighbors they smile. To family they offer excuses. To authorities they invent stories, anything to keep suspicion at bay. But behind those walls, a baby suffers, and Emmanuel suffered in silence. As we examine the timeline leading up to his disappearance, the questions grow more haunting. Days before Emmanuel was reported missing, there were whispers of unexplained bruises, reports of endless crying at night, family arguments spilling out into the street. And then suddenly Emmanuel was gone. And here lies the most devastating possibility. If Emmanuel was already the victim of severe abuse, could his disappearance itself have been the final act of concealment? Was it not a random tragedy, but a desperate attempt to cover up what had already been done to him? Think about that. A child whose body bore the evidence of violence suddenly vanishes. A timeline filled with contradictions. Parents whose stories don't align. Every inconsistency begins to look less like confusion and more like strategy. This is the uncomfortable truth. Abuse doesn't end with bruises. It extends into lies, manipulations, and sometimes into the unthinkable, erasing the very child who could expose the crime. And so the hardest question remains, the one Emmanuel cannot answer for himself. Was his disappearance meant to silence the evidence written across his fragile body? If that answer is yes, then this is not just neglect. It is not just failure. It is a crime against humanity. Because what does it say about us if the only way Emmanuel's suffering ends is through his disappearance? In cases of child abuse, there are always silent witnesses. People who saw something, heard something, felt something wasn't right, but didn't speak loudly enough. And in the case of Emmanuel Haro, the circle grows uncomfortably close to home. Relatives who spent time in the house, family members who noticed bruises that couldn't be explained, visitors who heard his cries echoing through the walls. Did they convince themselves it was nothing? Did they tell themselves, that's not my place to ask? Or did they know, deep down, but choose silence over confrontation? This is where guilt cuts the deepest. Because Emmanuel had no voice, no words, no way to tell anyone about the pain he was in. His only hope was that an adult, any adult, would step in and protect him. But when family stayed quiet, Emmanuel's suffering continued. Ask yourself, how many moments were lost? How many times could someone have picked up the phone, demanded answers, knocked on the door at midnight, when his crying wouldn't stop? How many chances were wasted before Emmanuel vanished? And here is the most haunting truth. Silence is not neutral. In abuse, silence is permission. In Emmanuel's case, silence may have been a death sentence. Because when a baby cries, it is not noise, it is a plea. When bruises appear, they are not accidents, they are warnings. When a family chooses not to act, the abuse does not stop, it escalates. And in Emmanuel's world, it escalated until the unimaginable happened. So yes, there were silent witnesses. But silence doesn't erase guilt, it spreads it. And every relative, every family friend, every person who looked away must now live with the truth. Emmanuel's blood is not only on the hands of the abuser, it stains the silence of those who could have saved him, but didn't. 7 months. That's all the time Emmanuel Haro had on this earth. 7 months of life, most of which should have been filled with lullabies, gentle touches, warm bottles, and safe arms. Instead, his short journey was marked by neglect, pain, and silence. And tonight, we're left with the question no one wants to face. How did an entire system, parents, family, neighbors, and authorities, allow this to happen? It is easy to point to the abuser. Easy to say, that's where the blame belongs. But the truth is far more devastating. Emmanuel's suffering was not hidden in some dark corner of the world. It was seen, it was heard, and it was ignored. Ignored by those who should have loved him most. Ignored by those who suspected, but said nothing. Ignored by the very institutions built to protect him. So I ask you, when a baby cries and no one listens, what kind of world have we built? When evidence of abuse is brushed aside, when warnings are dismissed, when systems collapse, whose hands are truly clean? This is the haunting legacy of Emmanuel Haro. His story forces us to look inward, to question whether silence is complicity, whether inaction is as deadly as violence itself. Because Emmanuel cannot speak for himself, he never will, but we can. And we must. If we allow his name to fade into the archives of another failed case, then we are just as guilty as those who hurt him. But if we demand justice, if we refuse to stay silent, if we make Emmanuel's story the line we will not allow to be crossed, then maybe, just maybe, his short life will not be wasted. So tonight, let Emmanuel Haro be more than a headline. Let his name weigh heavy on our conscience. Let it force us to ask the hardest question of all. When the next Emmanuel cries out, will we be brave enough to hear him? Because the truth is simple and devastating. Emmanuel did not fail the world. The world failed Emmanuel.